Great.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. I'm Callan Steinman. I'm Curator of Education here at the Georgia Museum of Art, and I'm so pleased to welcome you all to today's program. Without further ado, I'll hand things over to Jeff Richmond-Mall, American Art Curator, to begin today's presentation.
Thank you, Callan. I'm Jeff Richmond-Mall, Curator of American Art here at the Georgia Museum of Art, and I'm happy to welcome all of you to today's lecture, which launches our new exhibition at the museum entitled Extraordinary: Magic, Mystery, and Imagination in American Realism. The show opens to our members tomorrow night and to the public on Saturday and runs through June 13th. We extend our thanks to the exhibition sponsors, and we particularly want to thank Jonathan Bowes Gallery for their generous sponsorship of this afternoon's event. The show, the reason why we're gathered here today, Extraordinary, surveys a range of American artists in the 1930s through the 1970s who embraced sharp focus, suggestive ambiguity, and an uncanny assemblage of ordinary things. These artists turned to the mysterious, supernatural, and hyper-real to examine urgent social issues of their day, including race, class, war, and the environment. Rather than a means to escape reality, as the show argues, magic and imagination offered artists a way to engage more directly with contemporary life. I want to welcome the 100 attendees who are with us today. Thank you for being with us this afternoon. And joining all of us is our distinguished guest, Philip Eliasoph. He is an American art historian, critic, curator, and professor of art history and visual culture at Fairfield University. Dr. Eliasoph is critically acknowledged for his rediscovery of the magic realist pioneer Paul Cadmus. Emerging from his groundbreaking dissertation in 1979, Cadmus's 1981 National Retrospective Tour was the singular museum exhibition that Cadmus enjoyed during his lifetime. Dr. Eliasoph is a champion for academically trained American artists, and he has published widely on the topic. He has long advocated for a second look at artists whose careers were marginalized into the shadows and has promoted pre-World War II social and magic realism in successive monographs, exhibition catalogs, articles, and reviews. We are thrilled to welcome Dr. Eliasoph this afternoon for his lecture, Hide and Seek on the Magic Realist Playground, Unmasking Extraordinary Metaphors. Please join me in welcoming Philip Eliasoph.
Hello, and thank you, Jeff. I'm going to begin by telling you a story. I was 25 years old. I found myself in the office of Malcolm Forbes. Some of you may know it's the old Forbes magazine building down on Lower Fifth Avenue. I was photographing Paul Cadmus paintings that were in Mr. Forbes' personal collection in his office, in fact. And on his desk, there was a little sign with a phrase, and it said, "Presence is more than being there." So you can be certain how much I was looking forward to being there, coming down to Athens, Georgia, to participate and to see this extraordinary exhibition, Extraordinary: Magic, Mystery, and Imagination in American Realism. And I hope that all of you nearby are going to get there. Sadly, what a bummer, let's say, the COVID virus seems to have nixed my flight. But like Piero's Federico de Montefeltro and his bride, Battista Sforza, wearing her Louis Vuitton veil, I know that in this Zoom webinar link, I can assure you I'm 100% with all of you, and I'm very gratified that you're here for the ride. Now, a quick shout out, a note of gratitude to the entire staff and team at the Georgia Museum. Many years ago, I myself was a gallery director here at Fairfield University. And trust me, I know the exceptionally demanding, multitasking demands of curating and organizing and opening an exhibition. And honestly, folks, every person I interacted with in this past year, Jeff, Hillary, Amber, Callan, Linda, everyone models of professionalism and graciousness. Really a heartfelt note of appreciation for your collegiality. A special note and kudos to Museum Director William Elan, not only for assembling this really crackerjack team, but for his widely admired national leadership role with the American Alliance of Museums. To all involved in bringing this landmark exhibition to Athens, let me say quickly, bravissimo. The Georgia Museum of Art proudly owns a very important painting of Mr. Cadmus' Playground, painted in 1948. And it was the prescient understanding of the director at that time, Director William Paul, Bill Paul, as you call him in Athens, who really scored a real coup in purchasing this painting during one of his art safari expeditions to New York City and bringing this and acquiring it for the Georgia Museum of Art. Where to start in this story? Sometimes when we're lecturing and we go afar and we go off on tangents, sometimes we don't have the ability to bring it all together. So I'm going to start with really what you're about to see in the coming minutes, of the story I'm going to tell. On this Venn chart, you'll see that on the left, we're going to walk through what would have been the canonical story of modern art as it was being written and prescribed by Museum of Modern Art in New York. Most of this was pre-Stonewall, and that will be, I'll be discussing the humanist context, the transdisciplinarity of how we're going to look at American art of the 1940s to the 70s. Then we're going to meet the magic realists, the larger magic realist movement, many of whom, the 60 plus artists, are in the current show at the Georgia Museum. This was indeed a lost movement that completely lost its visibility in the American art scene, caused by a dramatic style shift. At the same time, I'm going to be talking to you about Paul Cadmus and his coterie and group of friends and colleagues, lovers, who were a type of American Bloomsbury group focused in Greenwich Village and in the Bohemia of Fire Island, a kind of pre-Stonewall world of queer art. And finally, through the interaction of all of these elements, my hope and my lifetime desire, I've been a champion and advocate for the resurrection and the revival and the reassessment of these artists with renewed appreciation, and that a younger generation, perhaps not so oppressively anti-academicism, will begin to appreciate their uniqueness. This has been Philip's project, and I hope you enjoy it. Personally, I feel as an art historian that I operate, and when I'm teaching my classes, I teach as a Jungian, and the events that are going to take place in this talk are simply too interrelated, the synchronicity of how and why all of this occurred to me and how I was able to meet and interact with this group of people, for me is a moment of, we'll call it just Jungian synchronicity. This is going to be a story about places and people and paintings. Simultaneously, I'll be working on art historical biographies, my own self-realized autobiography, and the Magic Realist group as a whole and their multiple biographies and triographies. The most significant discovery in my career was the liberation of this very important painting, Paul Cadmus's painting called The Fleet's Inn. This had been exhibited at the first exhibition of what was even before the WPA was the PWAP. It was seized by US Navy agents. pulled out of the Corcoran Gallery in April of 1934. It was sequestered and somehow ended up in some elite watering hole called the Alibi Club, where Supreme Court justices and United States senators went for their afternoon martini. With a legal team and friends and the leadership of gentlemen from the General Services Administration, we liberated this painting and brought it back into the public domain. Mr. Cadmus had the original receipt for $29. He had been paid as a WPA artist. And today, this painting happily is in the United States Naval History and Command Center. That story of the controversial, notorious painting on view after 47 years has been told and documented in the story of the Fleet's Inn, and how at this time, as a young graduate student, as it said in the New York Times, we had found this painting and I discovered it in the Alibi Club. The exhibition of American Realists and Magic Realists opened in 1943 on February 9. And how gratifying for my work over the last 45 years that there's been a renewal of interest at the ADA art show, the Armory show on Park Avenue. Literally 2 weeks before COVID shut down, we had Herschel and Adler Gallery doing it, magic and surrealism. We had the Jonathan Bowes Gallery with Melissa Wolf's really insightful essay, Painting a World Not Quite a Right. And I felt walking through the aisles of the New York Armory, I took a deep breath and I said, Philip, this is unbelievable. This is kismet. I can't believe that these artists are back in the limelight. Now, the painting that I'm going to begin with is by Pavel Chelachev. It's called Hide and Seek. And when I went to the Museum of Modern Art, when I was about 10, 11 years old, I can share with you that this was the painting that absolutely I was transfixed looking at this painting. And then 60 years later, I found myself assigned by Art in America magazine to tell the story of this painting and the other members of the Magic Realist School in a major exhibit called Lincoln Kirstein's Modern. Here again, I felt the circle of my life had come round and felt not only gratified, but deeply, deeply appreciative for the artists, the men and the women whose work was finally being recognized. Here is the painting, Chelachev's Hide and Seek. And if you were reading the art press and the reviews, this was the big hit of the show. The curators at the Modern had taken this down sometime in the 1990s, and I'm going to say this quite clearly, had basically hidden this painting away. It was too realistic, it was too phantasmagorical, and totally out of sync with the art movements and the avant-gardism of the 80s and 90s. I hadn't seen this painting, honestly, in decades. The painting is called Hide and Seek. And as most of us remember as children playing in our schoolyard or in our backyards, playing hide and seek. And I was always drawn to this idea of hide and seek, but I think that will tell us more in this narrative of what was being hidden and what we were seeking. Professor Angela Miller, I wrote a brilliant article recently. I find it so on target. Doubled images act out of a dynamic of disguise and revelation. It expresses a dream of ecstatic discovery, birth, copulation, and premonitions of death. Let's set the stage. It's 1943. We're in the darkest hour of the Second World War. Americans' first draftees are being sent to North Africa and about to prepare for Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. We're in the depths of World War II. The poster on the right, Bernard Perlin, who was one of the original Magic Realists, worked for the Office of War Information and did this brilliant image, Americans will always fight for liberty. We're in Times Square. The zipper with the news from Japan or from the Western Front was obviously everyone's preoccupation. Roger and Hammerstein's play, Oklahoma, would open a month later. And on Guadalcanal, after the meat grinder of losing 4,200 men were wounded and 1,600 American Marines and Army died on that isolated island in the South Pacific and the Solomon Islands. The victory on February 9, 1943, let's walk uptown to 53rd Street now. Let's walk up to the Museum of Modern Art, the good old MoMA, and upstairs, the opening of American Realist and Magic Realist. The preview party was February 9, 1943. The way you folks down in Athens are going to have your preview party tomorrow night, I hope you feel the bridge. I hope you feel the synchronicity. Now, here comes the Magus. Here comes the Prince. The choreographer of all this is none other than the great Lincoln Kirstein. Boston Brahmin, Harvard aesthete, archetypal Medicean prince, a Jewish prince from the Filene's Boston department store. His father was a major entrepreneur. His sporty circle of pals during his days at Harvard and starting the Hound and Horn magazine. He knew Nelson Rockefeller, Philip Johnson, Eddie Warburg was a real chum, and Alice Delamar. His coterie of highbrows, male hustlers, always in the mix, financial titans, but it is Lincoln Kirstein who induces ballet master choreographer George Balanchine to establish the New York City Ballet Company. And Balanchine literally is brought to America by Kirstein. 2 weeks after the opening, Kirstein is inducted into the Army. He goes to his training out in New Jersey, and soon he's a member of the Monuments Men Brigade, the art brigade of the US Army. Well, what is magic realism? We know what Impressionism or what Cubism is. What is magic realism? Kirstein writes in the catalog, by a combination of crisp edges, tightly intricate forms, and the counterfeiting of material surfaces such as paper, grain, or wood, our eyes are deceived into believing in the reality of what is rendered, whether factual or imaginary. Magic realists submit, and this is important, to a rigid discipline. Keep that word, that phrase, rigid discipline of manual dexterity, never spontaneous. Now I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, and I would be remiss without mentioning the groundbreaking work of Jeffrey Wexler and Greta Berman. Wexler really carried the water here in his exhibition with Greta Berman at Rutgers of 1982, and then following in this critical article in the Art Journal of 1985, trying to define magic realism. And the problem is that it was a slippery definition. Was it fantastical, symbolist, visionary? Truth be told, there really has never been settled law of what is magic realism. Let's go to the cradle of magic realism. We go to mapping as we map this journey. We go to the cradle we go downtown, down to the Lower West Side, down to Greenwich Village. And of 8 million stories in the naked city, here's one of them, a young artist named Paul Cadmus at age 30. No one knows who he is before his painting will make national headlines at the Fleet's Inn at the Corcoran in April of 1934. He's totally unknown. Cadmus and his art colleagues will eventually end up living on St. Luke's Place in Greenwich Village. Why would so many young gay men, gay and lesbian men and women live in the village? Because obviously in America, completely homophobic, time of great paranoia. I interviewed Gore Vidal, and he would tell me about he was constantly being harassed by United States government agents. government committees during the McCarthy era, employment of homosexuals and sex perverts in the government. This was a time of tremendous paranoia. The sex perverts that Senator McCarthy, in his nefarious ways, was going to reveal was part of the so-called Lavender Scare. But Greenwich Village, Greenwich Village. Greenwich Village was a place where you might have worked in government, or you might have been a school teacher, or you might have been a prominent banker. You had to play that role during the day, but at night, Greenwich Village was a place where gay culture in America found it was a hospitable place. I recommend George Chauncey's master study, Gay New York, Gender, Urban Culture, and the Making of the Gay World. Uptown was Harlem. And here again, on the fringe, a societal group on the fringe, the Harlem Renaissance, the Negro Black scene of Harlem. We understand how that was also seminal in the seeding of a new type of alternative culture in America. And here is home base, number 5, St. Luke's Place in Greenwich Village, the cradle of magic realism, as I call it. And there, in that studio, in the manner of great easel painters and academicians of the past, whether Tiepolo or Vermeer, here we see Cadmus and George Tooker and Jared French. Mr. Cadmus is painting a work called What I Believe. This photograph was taken by George Platt Lyons. Now, my colleague, Jonathan Weinberg, has assiduously and made such great interpretation of this photograph. In fact, Tooker was Cadmus's current lover, but Cadmus had been lovers with French before. And despite French's recent marriage to the painter Margaret Honig, Cadmus and French continued to be intimate. Jared would say that he wasn't prepared to share Paul. So Paul was with George at this time, and it was sort of a day-night menage a trois. Here they are, the 3 founders of the Magic Realist group of Greenwich Village, Cadmus, Tooker, and Jared French. The women in the circle, and these women, whether this was bisexuality, we need not really delve into the issue. Perhaps Margaret, for most of her life, she was 15 years older than Jared French. She was his escort and his beard, as it would be known at that time, a beard. Also, the other woman in the group is Fidelma Cadmus Kirstein. Kirstein met Paul Cadmus at a social event, was romantically attracted to Paul, so handsome, so striking. Cadmus was disinterested in any relationship, any sexual relationship. And then Kirstein came up with this idea, that's great, why don't I marry your sister then, Fidelma? And Fidelma was this dutiful and loyal companion. And so here we have Lincoln Kirstein, who is the puppet master of the entire group, really controlling this circle. But above all of them are paying homage. The deity is the old Bloomsbury novelist E.M. Forster. Forster is depicted in the painting you just saw on the easel that Cadmus was painting, What I Believe, which is now at Notre Dame. Here in this scene of this utopian paradise, here is Christopher Isherwood, Cadmus, Jared French, Margaret French, and the sage of Cambridge, E.M. Forster. It's a post-war image. The world of fascism and totalitarianism has been defeated. And here, using old humanist Bloomsbury sense of kindness and decency, a new world is being constructed. Look carefully at how Cadmus places himself in front of a lighthouse. So this becomes the next iteration of an American Bloomsbury group, an American Bloomsbury. Oddballs, also with sexual triangles and affairs and libertine values. Here we see Mr. Cadmus, Mr. Tooker, and Mr. Foster in 1949. I've always considered myself queer in a Bloomsbury sort of manner, Mr. Cadmus told me. Well, you had to leave the heat and dirt of Manhattan, and when it came time for a vacation, let's go out to the Great South Bay and take the ferry across the Great South Bay to Fire Island. A. Hyatt Mayer, the print curator at the Metropolitan Museum, in a satirical way, would often kid Mr. Cadmus, saying, "Yes, Paul, I know, it's the Fire Island School of Art." Fire Island, this magnificent strip of post-Diluvian white sand formed from the last Laurentian Shield Glacier of 40,000 years ago, leaving this fine white beach only 30 miles east of Greenwich Village, but a place where people, gay men and women, could escape. And here, looking at the White House, tying to its ancient roots, E.M. Foster's Alexandria History and Guide, Pharos and Farallon, not the old Coast Guard lighthouse at Fire Island, but here Cadmus is turning that Pharos, that lighthouse, into a phallic-looking object emanating light. Now, European surrealism was driven by the heterosexual dreams and fantasies, the suppressed sexual appetites of Salvador Dali and René Magritte. They were also, of course, expressing their maybe phallocentrism. But it is in Fire Island that we find the beachhead of the Magic Realist School of Greenwich Village. Esther Newton, writing about Cherry Grove, Fire Island, for thousands of gay men and lesbians in America, Cherry Grove was the oldest continuously inhabited resort on Fire Island. It was a place where you could stroll arm in arm without hesitation, to leave the curtains open without fear. This is from the Pajama photography album. These photographs belong to the Smithsonian. Kirstein called it Sodom by the Sea, Sodom by the Sea, in Salt Air, where the Kirstein cottage was until it was destroyed in the hurricane of '38. And there, Mr. Cadmus paints his first great egg tempera work, Shells and Figure, featured in this current exhibition. What a transition from the social satire and from the comedy and the stinging social satire. These paintings are very small. Mr. Cadmus said to me that he almost felt that he was invisible at this time in his life. Some of the finest early works of Cadmus come from this period. Point of View up at Williams College, the clarity, the absolute, the sense of ennui, the sense of doing nothing, no, not even a transistor radio, completely primitive living out in a shack without electricity. This was Fire Island. Even the Fire Island that I started to visit in the 1960s was still a rather primitive and wonderful place at that time. Now, the situation in New York at the Museum of Modern Art is being lorded over, of course, by the great Alfred Barr, who comes up with this canonical chart that, let's face it, modern art begins in Paris. It's the parade. It's the march from Impressionism to Post-Impressionism to Cubism to Constructivism and Futurism, etc. And when I interviewed Glenn Lowry, the director of MoMA in 2005, and I said, Mr. Lowry, why is the Hopper being hidden? Why is Andrew Wyeth's painting, Christina's World, one of the most popular paintings? Why is it being hidden? If you visited the MoMA in the last 20 years, these paintings were in corridors. They were next to the men's and women's room, next to the elevator shafts. And Lowry was perfectly transparent. Honestly, these artists don't really work with the meta narrative. Abstract expressionism arrives like a great hurricane, a force 5 hurricane hitting the New York art world in the late 40s. Pollock is touted in Life magazine as is he America's greatest painter, August 1949. And let's face it, and let me be very clear, I totally get it. I teach Pollock, Rothko, de Kooning, Krasner, Frankenthaler. These are very important artists. What I'm trying to explain is that they swept away the remnants of this realist school in Mark Tansey's brilliant parody. We see Picasso and Breton and Matisse in World War I military attire, and they're signing an armistice with Barnett Newman and Ad Reinhardt and de Kooning and Motherwell and Harold Rosenberg, the art critic of the New Yorker, and Clement Greenberg. The world has shifted like the surrender at Breda from Paris to New York in the post-war era. After you drop an atomic bomb and you see millions of dead people at Auschwitz, what else is there to paint? Meanwhile, Ad Reinhardt, 1946, again, the expression of the Roman cynic Juvenal, tell the truth while laughing through satire. Here we have a graveyard in a PM magazine, and in the grave, here are all the new artists, Pollock and Gorky and Toby, and the artists that are relegated to the graveyard are Grant Wood, Thomas Hart Benton, John Stewart Curry, and Paul Cadmus. Also a great artist named author Schick, another great artist, next to Poor and Kroll. The picture artist, the realist, banality, confusion, they were hacks. The abstract artists were inventive. They had dignity. They showed order and creativity and clarity. Now, don't believe Philip. Let's look at the market conditions. The highest price, gavel price for a George Tooker is $432,000 for this Tooker painting. Whereas a giant Rothko, which would have been sold for a couple of $100 in 1961, sold for $86 million in 2012. Here's another valuation. The king of the magic realist, Andrew Wyeth. The highest auction price for a Wyeth was $10.3 million. And the sale, David Geffen sold his Pollock for $140 million. If I was in a courtroom, I would argue, I rest my case, this school of artists had essentially been erased. And in fact, when I met this group of artists and I first encountered them, and I appreciate Jeffrey Richmond Mall's comment, the meta-poetics of magic realism, I could have spent 5 lifetimes writing about these artists. I've published a book on Vickrey and Browning. I've always adored Peter Bloom. I'm fascinated by Priscilla Warren Roberts, and of course, the great Henry Kerner. Meanwhile, in Philip's life, what's going on? Well, I'm just a kid in the 60s, right in the middle of the Cultural Revolution. I'm attending the moratorium against the Vietnam War. I'm going to the Fillmore East, going to see Neil Young, and going to Grateful Dead shows. And the 60s ends with those 3 days up at Woodstock. Thinking about academic and magic realism is the last thing on my mind. I'm spending every weekend in Greenwich Village, and I'm aware that I love Greenwich Village in my weekends. I grew up just in a suburb outside of downtown New York. I would go with my friends every weekend to the village and explore the world of the clubs and the head shops. And this was where it was happening. We knew that there was a gay culture, but it was still very repressed at this time. Then everything changes. That is, on June 28th, some New York cops come and beat up lesbian and gay uh, people at the famous Stonewall, and the Stonewall Revolution begins. And this was truly a turning point in gay history. Think about how long we've come, how far the road has been from homosexuality being punishable with jail time. Think about that the American Psychiatric Association diagnosed homosexuality as a mental illness until 1973, when 5,800 psychiatrists voted to eliminate it as a mental illness, and 3,800 psychiatrists wanted it to remain on the books as a mental illness. I had a fellowship to study at the State University at Binghamton, and I had the privilege of meeting Kenneth Lindsay, who was the preeminent Kandinsky scholar in America. I went there to study and to write my dissertation about Vasily Kandinsky. This is what I thought a great painting looked like in 1973. This was what I was going to write my PhD about. And then Professor Lindsay shows this slide, the very painting in Athens, Georgia playground. And he says, this is one of America's greatest artists of the 30s, but frankly, I've not seen a scholarly article about him in 40 years. My fellow graduate students ask me, why would I want to write about a dinosaur named Paul Cadmus? Also, I had a great professor named Albert Boehm, recently deceased, who was reviving the role of the French Academy and teaching us what was happening here in the École des Beaux-Arts. And as I then began to explore the work of Cadmus, I realized he was tied to a very large tradition. I'm looking at Cadmus drawings and paintings, comparing Cadmus drawings to the work of Ingres and the great French or academic masters. And of course, the ballet is part of the discipline, the classical style, Cadmus is doing drawings, helping Lincoln Kirstein. He's doing drawings for various ballets, including the filling station, which were shown recently at MoMA. Mr. Cadmus, at this time, when I met him, said to me, look, I think that Thomas Eakins' painting of the swimming pool is the single greatest painting in America. Now, here I need to be very clear. This is the unresolved business. And I, Philip, am not going to be arbiter or judge of this. I've enjoyed a healthy, respectful conversation with my colleagues discussing this. Mr. Cadmus very clearly said, as he said, I consider myself a queer of the old Bloomsbury manner. He was not comfortable in a kind of militant point of view. This rose to the point that Mr. Cadmus wrote a famous letter to Art in America in 1992 in which he said, gayness was never the raison d'etre of my art. Now this gets deep and complicated, and I accept with my students and fellow academics the complexity, the contradictions. Of course, people are proud of heritage, race, religion. Everyone should be proud of who and what they are. But to be defined as an artist, should Chagall be put into the ghetto of identity politics? Oh, Chagall, the Jew artist. Oh, O'Keeffe, what a woman. Frida Kahlo, Mexican. Kahinde, is he more than just a Black artist? Wilfredo Lam, Cuban, African, but a great modernist. Jean-Michel says it so simply, I'm not a Black artist, I am an artist. Here again, with deep respect, I don't have the answer to this question, but I put it out there because Mr. Cadmus felt so strongly about that. Here we begin to see how the Cadmus iconography is a flowing from Greco-Roman Hellenism to the adoration of the human body. And here in this painting at the Wadsworth, the architect, where the muse is this nude Praxitelean figure, I like very much what a young gay writer, Marcos Chin, says, in Muddy Colors, he says, Cadmus was codified gay male desire and identity. He lived in a time of homophobic social surroundings. He helped to incite the formation of gay art in America, and that is absolutely true. So our work begins in the 70s. I wrote first the Catalogue Raisonné. I had to get a complete listing of his work. At that time, he had only painted 125 works. He said that overproduction was the great vice of the modern painter. My epistolary archive and exchange with Mr. Cadmus is a precious archive where he was so willing to work with me, explain some of the paintings. I think the greatest statement he made was about the Fleet's Inn. I never thought of shocking. I just exposed the shock I felt. In the 70s, we realized that we were going to try to restore him to the place that Mr. Cadmus deserved. Here we are with wonderful dear Mary Gruskin of the old Midtown Galleries. Now that the 7 Deadly Sins belong to the Metropolitan Museum, I had a long correspondence with him about the meaning of these paintings of the sins. And here is another moment in American museum history. We mounted a retrospective, we proposed it to the Whitney, and Lincoln Kirstein was bitterly protesting that the Whitney felt uncomfortable to present an exhibit of gay art in the early 80s. This was, of course, at the height of the gay AIDS plague. I'm happy to report that our colleague and friend, Dr. Randall Griffey, has restored the Cadmus paintings to the Met, and they're installed. They're beautifully installed. The next time you visit the Met, you'll see them. Mr. Cadmus, in his entire almost 95 years, only had one retrospective at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, and this was a great moment. Of course, at that moment, it was the first time we were able to show him the Fleet's Inn, the painting that had been taken out of the exhibition in 34. There's a backstory to this, that the Navy this is sort of the dark side of when Franklin Roosevelt was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He set up a sting operation with decoys looking for sex perverts in Newport. They arrested 20 sailors in 1919. So this story about the Fleet's Inn has a lot of depth about the role of Navy sailors and gay sailors, and it all explodes at the Corcoran in 1934. The cartoons are in every major daily newspaper in the United States in the month of April 1934. And I nearly fell to my knees when I walked into the camp exhibit at MoMA in at the Met in 2019 to see that the Fleet's Inn. I had no idea it was part of the great camp exhibit. And then into the 90s, more and more work. I made sure I documented every book that was in Mr. Cadmus's library. At this time, I don't know what we were thinking. Mr. Cadmus had a ponytail, and I guess I grew one also. I guess I wanted to be in au courant like Mr. Cadmus. Now look at a painting like Finisterre of 1952. Take a good look at what's going on here. Do you see the disguised imagery? Remember being in art history class, Art History 101, when your professor taught you about to look at how a Flemish painting, as taught by the great Erwin Panofsky of Princeton, when he writes in early Netherlandish painting, spiritualia sub metaphoras corporalium, corporeal metaphors of things spiritual. Hence, instead of the little fetus images or little images of the Holy Spirit and incarnation iconography, baguettes become extended phalluses, handlebars become erections turned, signals. These are codified metaphors of male desire. For the Main Street painting, for the mural at Port Washington, a WPA painting, Cadmus shows a young rough, a young tough, sitting on the back of a fire hydrant, sitting on a fire hydrant. I feel very much in the way that Salvador Dali is using the image in his horns, auto-sodomizing his female. It becomes a transference. Back to St. Luke's Place and the playground. The playground is named after Jimmy Walker, rather corrupt mayor in New York in the 1920s and 30s. The Cadmus apartment, Tooker French apartment, is right across the street. The painting was clearly influenced when Mr. Cadmus went to travel to Florence in the 1930s with Jared French. He loved this painting by Jacopo Pontormo in the Santa Felicita, Florence, at the foot of the Ponte Vecchio. The next time you're on the Ponte Vecchio, find this little chapel. And here is Pontormo's Mannerist, you remember this from Art History 101, his deposition. But for Cadmus, he uses the young Adonis figure looking out in a Shakespearean soliloquy, asking us, where do I fit in this world, in this street? And that connects me to my favorite play as a boy. West Side Story completely transformed my world. No one had ever seen a Broadway play. No one had ever seen, and then later the 1961 movie, which wins at 10 Academy Awards, in which choreography and dance is transferring the idea of movement and sexual repression and energy. Who wrote West Side Story? 4 gay Jewish men. Stephen Sondheim, who I've interviewed, Leonard Bernstein, Jerome Robbins, and Arthur Lawrence was the producer. As gay men, as Jewish gay men of a minority, when you hear interviews with Mel Brooks or with Carl Reiner, they always would say the reason the Jews were always in the theater is that it was like as though we were sitting up in the balcony looking down at American culture, knowing how marginalized as gay Jews these men were. But Jerome Robbins credited Cadmus's shore leaf painting of 38 with the choreography of the great ballet epic Fancy Free, which becomes the Frank Sinatra, Bing Crosby on the Town movie. West Side Story, a fight for possession of the street, a small space that had grand symbolism, according to Jerome Robbins. Here is the original 57 team, and then you'll see the 1961 movie in this short clip.
Turn off the juice box. Just play it cool, boy. Real cool. Pow. Pow.
West Side Story, the global sensation of 1961, winning 10 Academy Awards. How was it that Paul Cadmus in 1948 paints this character? You would think that the casting was exactly taken from Cadmus's playground for this character named Tiger in this 1961 film. Now, to understand West Side Story in context, you have to appreciate that this was in the post McCarthy era. America was beginning to feel more open, away from the oppression of the McCarthyism. Marlon Brando was the teen idol in The Wild One. James Dean was in Rebel Without a Cause. And the closeted pre gay liberation emotions were finding an outlet in the kind of deviant juvenile delinquency depicted in West Side Story, sizzling sexual angst. This was being studied, meanwhile, at Indiana University's famous Dr. Alfred Kinsey, and it's well known. Kinsey would visit the Lincoln Kirstein townhouse, go upstairs and observe orgies, and then very quietly, sitting there in his bow tie, make little notes and go back to Indiana University, having participated or been a voyeur in some of the, let's say, sexual behaviors. His first book, 48, was The Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. This was very important in the Magic Realist group in the Cadmus French circle. They felt someone was finally looking at what homosexuality and non-binary sex was about. This drawing by Mr. Cadmus was uh, exhibited at the David Zwirner Gallery in New York, along with many of the other drawings from the Kinsey Institute at Indiana University. There are other issues of camouflage and disguise and using metaphors. For example, for the Latina community, it was a catastrophe. Young Puerto Rican feminist scholar Dr. Frances Negron Munater says that she was heartbroken that the role of Maria was played by Natalie Wood in brown face. Puerto Ricans were stereotyped into this image. Men and women of my generation will still think of Puerto Ricans from this I Like to Live in America scene in West Side Story. The whole issue of, again, set of identity, characters that were in brown face or were ethnic stereotypes is part of this heritage. There's even one more element of masquerade. The first transgender figure to appear in an American stage and movie is this figure, Anybody. Anybody was the first transgender youth. It was played by actor Susan Oakes. Anybody was a tomboy. No one wanted her in the Jets gang. She didn't belong, but she's harassed and rejected. No wonder why the most popular song of all of the gay men's choirs around the world is Somewhere. Somewhere there'll be a place for us. The time rolls on. By the 1980s and 90s, Mr. Cadmus is resurging in popularity, and we're so delighted to see he's getting finally his acknowledgement. Mapplethorpe comes into the scene. The Mapplethorpe kerfluffle at the Corcoran. I wrote a letter to the New York Times after the Mapplethorpe show had been rejected at the Corcoran, and I reminded everyone that it had been Mr. Cadmus who had first been rejected. I had the privilege of driving Mr. Cadmus in my Jeep. My wife and I drove him into New York City, down to Lower Manhattan, Lower Broadway. We spent an afternoon at Chuck Close's studio. I made the introduction through a common friend of mine, the great artist Robert Cottingham, and I introduced Chuck Close to Mr. Cadmus. And Chuck Close wanted to do, and he does, two great paintings. This one in the Philadelphia Museum, and this gigantic 8-footer at the Erie Art Museum. But what was Cadmus about? He was a deeply romantic, kind, gentle man. And it, I think, best depicted in this romantic Belle Epoque painting, the homage to Rinaldo Hahn, The Untied Ribbon. Because in the way that Bernard Shaw had made Pygmalion and Galatea, the subject of Pygmalion, the idea of the muse, this was Mr. Cadmus's feeling. He felt transfixed with art, beauty, and love, like the Gérôme painting, And his muse was John Anderson. Mr. Cadmus was about to be 95 years old. He came to our house to have lunch. He said, I'm perfectly well. I can eat all the pate. My doctor says I'm in perfect health. We had lunch at a French bistro. Ladies and gentlemen, this was the last photograph of Paul Cadmus. I took this photo on December 10, 1999. He died on Sunday night, 2 days later, 5 days short of his 95th birthday. Mr. Cadmus's obituary appeared a few days later in the New York Times. Mr. Cadmus had told me that he had wanted his ashes to be thrown into the Hudson River, but John Anderson wanted to be buried next to him in the family plot in New Haven, next to in the Grove Street Cemetery. It's a beautiful place. And when I once asked Mr. Cadmus, sum up your life in art, he said, everything is in what I believe. I believe in E.M. Foster's. I believe in an aristocracy of the sensitive, the considerate, and the plucky. Its members are to be found in all nations and classes, and there is a secret understanding. They, you people interested in magic realism, you who understand the eternal values of art, you understand they represent the true human condition, the one permanent victory over cruelty and chaos. And boy, have we seen a lot of cruelty and chaos in the last few years. So the masquerade, the camouflage of identity using masks, for some, this specific group of artists, at the very seed of magic realism, it was a game of hide and seek, and it's come out wherever you are, because love conquers all. Thank you, everybody, for your very kind attention. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Well, thank you, Philip. And yes, I'd love to have some time here for anyone in the audience to ask any questions you might have. Feel free to just type those into the Q&A box there on the bottom if you press that button. If you don't have questions, that's okay, but we'd love to hear anything from you. While we're waiting, I will say that we have not only enjoyed having Philip be a part of this event today, but he contributed just a wonderful introduction to the book that accompanies Extraordinary. Our Director of Communications, Hillary Brown, just posted the link to that in the chat. Please feel free to check that out. So we have our first question here. It is from Ginny Duncan, who says, thank you so much for this incredible talk. I was wondering if you have examples of queer women artists who worked within the bounds of magic realism, and if you have any thoughts on what the movement might have offered queer women artists in contrast to queer men. Are they in some way more invisible / hidden, both then and now?
Ginny Duncan, I really have to tell you at this point that I couldn't say that I have great examples of queer women artists. And I think it was even more, I think you're right in that their repression and suppression was even more invisible. It has not been a part of what I've been working on. So I have to say, I think you're going to leave that, and that'll be a good thing for all of us to find out. Okay.
And I'll just add that Philip mentioned the 1943 MoMA show. There were only 2 women included in the exhibition, Audrey Buller and Vanessa Helder. But I think there's more to be done even on Margaret French too, as who you already referenced, Philip.
Yes.
And he was not only linked to the circle, was an artist in herself and a photographer with Paul Cadmus and Jared French. So we have another question from Janice Simon, professor here at UGA, who is asking if, Philip, you could discuss more of the imagery in Playground, specifically the Superman-like figure, the women washer in the background. Just any more you could
Okay.
add about that.
Well, thanks, Janice, for your question. Look, and in the curatorial file at Athens, Mr. Cadmus, the location is that playground across the street, but he did wander all over New York City. He did wander, and the Superman figure, I think that Cadmus was using it as the juvenile delinquency, the idea of a youth trying to escape, trying to transcend this tight space of this urban jungle, the asphalt jungle. I recently watched the film, I recommend it, with Glenn Ford, The Asphalt Jungle. Has a lot of this pent up sexual, everybody who's of a certain age here, who would, that we lived through the 50s and the Eisenhower and the Kennedy era, but sexuality, this was the big blossoming of the 60s and the hippie movement and the counterculture. I was right in the center of it. How I ended up from the Fillmore East to Woodstock and ending up in the Paul Cadmus studio was like Nijinsky doing a 180 pirouette. It was completely, but it was sexual repression was everywhere, everywhere.
So we have a couple thank yous to you, Philip, for your lecture in the chat and the Q&A. I wanted to make sure you saw those. But we have more questions. Veronica Roberts, who's from the Blanton Museum, asks if you can say anything more about Priscilla Roberts, who is in the Extraordinary exhibition, her lay figure. But Philip, if you wanted to mention anything about her.
Well, I regret, Roberts lived here in Connecticut, and I regret that I didn't spend time to go and interview her. She lived at the end of her life, maybe 30 minutes away from where I live. But I think she's absolutely crackerjack painter. I see on the screen, Jeff, that Mary Gruskin's nephew is saying thanks. And dear, it was Alan Gruskin and Mary Gruskin who took on Paul Cadmus in their gallery in 1937. And they never had a contract. There was never a piece of paper between them. It was just a handshake. It was one of the most harmonious and beneficial artist-gallerist relationships anyone I've ever known of. Hats off to the Gruskin family who supported Paul Cadmus for decades.
So we have a question. This is from Morris Grossman, who says, do you feel the CIA's promotion of abstract expressionism as a move in the Cultural War with the Soviet Union affected the trajectory of artists like Kerner, Cadmus, and French?
101%. The paranoia. Look, I mentioned this briefly. Men and women who were going on with their lives, paying the rent, having jobs as insurance salesmen, bank executives, working in the New York publishing world, they had to live a dual life. It was a completely dual life. You would go to your office. You might have been a little, maybe your office mates knew that you were a little queer, but in the McCarthy era of the 50s, these men and women lived under constant threat of exposure. McCarthy said, we are going to expose the communists and the pervert homosexuals among us. Now, as the 60s came on, there was this great release, this great sense of we can be ourselves. I like to teach my classes, Black civil rights movement is number one. I had the privilege of hearing Dr. King in 1963 at a rally in Uniondale out in Long Island in the 60s. That led, of course, to the women's feminist movement of the 70s, and then the gay movement by the 70s and 80s. So this was a very different time in America, and it's very different. I want the young students, the young generation today to understand that this is why Mr. Cadmus had to use disguises, had to use really a type of almost had to use subversive ways. It was dangerous. You were going to be beat up by some mafia guys. That's what happened at the Stonewall. Gay people were constantly being preyed upon and being bullied and physically harmed, men and women, gay and lesbian women. And that's why Fire Island and Provincetown were the two places where you could be safe. Fire Island, Provincetown, and the Castro district in San Francisco. Let's not forget San Francisco.
So we have two sort of related questions. One from Chris Walther. Sorry if I pronounced your name wrong. Do you have any thoughts about the intersection of precisionism and magic realism? If one looks at the 1943 show, the two movements seem to blend together. And then another question, sort of relatedly, from Jamie Franklin, who asked about Luigi Lucioni and how that artist might fit into this circle.
Lucioni was a very close classmate of Cadmus at the National Academy. He did a very important portrait that is now in the collection of the Brooklyn Museum. And Lucioni was definitely a close friend within this circle. He went eventually to live up in Vermont, but he was closely tied to this circle. And he did one of the greatest portraits of Paul Cadmus in the Brooklyn Museum. What was the next?
It was just about precisionism and magic realism.
All right. Mr. Cadmus and Mr. Tooker always spoke about clarity. Their idea of a painting was one that had a narrative structure, but presented with the greatest clarity. On my hand, I could share with you the artists that Cadmus think about in terms of why Demuth, why Sheeler, why the Precisionists were so admired because of the clarity. Cadmus loved the work of Piero della Francesca, Bellini, Mantegna, Signorelli. He loved that idea, that crisp, logical clarity. And the American Precisionist revived that in the 1930s. So there's definitely a close alliance there, absolutely.
And I'd also add that the MoMA's 1943 show on American Realists and Magic Realists included Charles Sheeler, Edward Hopper as sort of the 20th century pioneers of this new phenomenon that Barr and Dorothy Miller, who we shouldn't forget about, another important woman in the mix, these pioneers who came before, not to mention the fact that Thomas Eakins, Winslow Homer, Raphael Peale were also part of a sort of historical prelude in the exhibition. So what a whirlwind show that was. Joshua Johnson asks about the connection between the playground figure and Pontormo. I would suggest that you, not to plug the book again, but Philip has a little discussion of that in the catalog, so I'll leave that as a teaser. Let's do just two more questions here. One from Jesus Escobar from Northwestern University. Thank you for this wonderful visual tour through history. Can you talk even in general terms about the challenges of using biography in writing art history?
Dear Jesus, one of my dear colleagues who's moved on from Fairfield University to Northwestern. Thank you, Jesus, and I'm glad you're with us today. Well, as I tried to interlace in my introduction, I think Jesus had mentioned to me, you were at another conference and you were teaching your architecture class. My life with this circle has been a Jungian role of synchronicity, of me of interviewing Mr. Cadmus, but also trying to unravel the threads, the interface, and the interconnections of this movement. So definitely biography and the writing of art history go hand in hand. And my attempt, however clumsily I've done it, I've tried to stitch together into this tapestry to resurrect and to reappreciate the lives of these men and women. I cannot tell you, when I was coming out of graduate school, it was the early mid-70s, and these artists, if I share with you, they were humiliated. They had been some of the most important figures in the front of the American art world. They were the Encyclopedia Britannica of 1942 named 5 artists as the leading American artists: Thomas Hart Benton, John Stewart Curry, Grant Wood, Lanning, and Paul Cadmus. 5 artists. Paul Cadmus, 1938. By 1958, no one knew who Paul Cadmus was. I only found literature on Paul Cadmus in gay literature, underground literature. I was going to Greenwich Village every week and buying gay material, gay magazines. And Paul was so humiliated that he had been one of America's key artists in the 30s, and he had been reduced to this small. It had made him small, and that's part of this issue about breaking out into being an artist.
I'm just going to answer one question that came in, and then leave the final, what I think is the $1 million question, to you, Philip. The other question that I'll just answer briefly, Andrew Rose asks about how influential Fidel McCadmus was in the group. I think that's a great question. I just point out, we have the 1943 MoMA show, and then 7 years later, after Kirstein has had his public break from MoMA, he organizes 2 shows called Symbolic Realism, one at the Edwin Hewitt Gallery in New York City, and then the other at the Institute for Contemporary Arts in London. 2 different checklists under one banner of this new category of symbolic realism. The New York show included not only Jared French, George Tooker, Andrew Wyeth, Pavel Chaluchev, Bernard Perlin, Paul Cadmus, but also Fidel McCadmus, Margaret French. So that is kind of an example of how, how these sort of links throughout this group and beyond continue into the next decade. That catalog is only apparently in one library in the country, I think in Santa Barbara. So you can try to get a hold of that if you'd like. But the final question for you, Philip, is what are the 2 most important reasons magical realism deserves greater recognition in modern American art? And this is from Tucker Mays.
Okay, well, Mr. Mays, the 2 most important reasons is, number one, I believe strongly that it was on one of the golden links on the golden chain of the great academic tradition. At Paul Cadmus's 90th birthday party celebration at the National Academy, we had a 90th birthday celebration, and Chuck Close read the introduction. And in Chuck Close's introduction, Chuck quoted something that Paul had often said. Mr. Cadmus said this: "My teacher was Charles Hawthorne. Hawthorne had studied with Jerome in Paris. Jerome had studied with Ingres. Ingres had studied with David. David had been a disciple of Poussin, and Poussin had been the disciple of Raphael." Why is magic realism important? Because it is a golden bead on a thread going back to Greek and Roman classicism, the high Renaissance era of Raphael, the world of academic, and the world, as Horace wrote, ut pictura et poesis, a picture is like a poem. And Dr. Jeffrey tells us, just as you said, it is the metapoetics that goes back to the very source of Greco-Roman Hellenic classicism. That's number one. Number two, I feel that as a movement in the 20th century, we saw the liberation of the Surrealist, how Magritte, if you go to the Magritte Museum in Brussels, if you go to the Dali Museum, you realize that these are artists through their spectacular draftsmanship and ability, their trompe-l'oeil realism. Magritte and Dali are surrealist, but their surrealism is largely about binary sexuality, heterosexuality. This group of magic realists used the source of surrealism, the liberation of the unconscious, Freudian unconsciousness, allowing their desires, male desire, to come to the forefront. Disguised, yes, it was dangerous to be gay in the 1940s and 50s, but they put it right on the surface in a world before Stonewall and before the Cultural Revolution and the sexual revolution of the 60s.
Well, thank you so much, Philip, for your presentation, for spending some extra time answering these questions. Thanks everyone in the audience for being here. The exhibition, as I said, opens this Saturday and runs through June 13th. We're open Thursday through Sundays. Just visit our website to get your free reservation for tickets. We'll have some continued programming for this show, including a panel called Interdisciplinary Perspectives on Magic Realism with scholars from film, Romance languages, and art history in March. A lecture from Angela Miller in April. So please continue to tune in, and thank you all again for being here, and thank you, Philip.
Thank you all. Thank you all. Art matters. Remember that. Art matters. Thank you all.